Leslie, I'll grab that.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for braving the cold and coming out tonight. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. Tonight, we are so excited to have Jen Percy and Leslie Jamison with us to celebrate the launch of Jen's newest book, Both from Dead. This book, which has already topped several most anticipated and best book lists for this fall season, explores the plethora of women's experiences enduring and surviving sexual violence. As many reviewers and blurbers have already noted, Jen truly captures what it means to be a woman today, what it looks like and feels like to hold shame and compartmentalize trauma and stay silent. Now that silence has been given not just one voice, but many, and there's so much within these pages to discuss. Before we officially get started, though, I just have a few logistics to point out, some quick bios to read, and then we will dive right in. First up, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Jen will be around to personalize your books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And finally, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Girls Play Dead online using the link in the live stream description. Now for tonight's wonderful guest, Jen Percy, who is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine and recipient of the National Magazine Award for Feature Writing. She's the author of the nonfiction book Demon Camp, which was a New York Times notable book. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, Jen has published essays in the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times Book Review, Harper's, and elsewhere. She teaches at Columbia University. And as I mentioned earlier, Leslie Jamison joins Jen in conversation tonight. Leslie is the author of the New York Times bestsellers Splinters, The Recovering and the Empathy Exams, the collection of essays Make It Scream, Make It Burn, and the novel The Gin Closet. She writes for numerous publications, including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. She also teaches at Columbia and lives in Brooklyn. That's all from me. Please join me in giving Leslie and Jen a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Jen, congratulations. I just feel so honored and just really moved to be here with you tonight, just recognizing this thing you've made and talking about it. And even though maybe it's a little bit strange, I wanted to read to everybody here part of this note that I wrote to you after I finished reading the book, just because the experience for me of reading this book was so compelling, so moving, so upsetting, so generatively provocative, that I wanted to write to you the moment I finished it. And I just wanted to bring the room into some of that feeling of what this book does and what it produces. I know some people in this room already know, but for the rest of you, you need to read this book. So I wanted to begin our conversation there, and then ask you some questions, and hopefully at certain points kind of hear a little bit of the book in your voice as well. Okay, so I just finished reading your book, which was absolutely staggering. It's brutal, yes, but also beautiful, not despite, but through everything that's so difficult in it, because it's willing to look right at violence, violence that is so often pushed out of view in ways that deeply compound it, and to ask that this violence be recognized, seen more clearly, honored in the fullness of its impact. It just feels so urgent, so vital, such a gift to society, honestly. And I know this might sound overblown or sentimental, but I don't know any other way to say it. It's such a gift to survivors and everyone who wants to support them, to all of us who owe them and ourselves more than the reductive narratives we've foisted onto trauma and its aftermath. I felt overwhelmed by feeling reading it, and with the strength and depth and rigor of your compassion. It's a really, really magnificent achievement. And I thought maybe to begin, you could just tell us a little bit about how this book began for you, where it began, how it evolved, how it became the thing it is today.
Yeah, and thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with you, and I can't imagine doing this conversation with anyone else. It's really wonderful. And I also want to take a moment to thank Books Are Magic for sponsoring us, and Thomas, thank you, and my editor, lovely right here. Jen, Sarah Jean, Elena, Whitney, thank you guys so much. So yeah, I'll talk about the origins of this book, which starts in a strange place, actually, which is with a moment I was just watching videos of animals playing dead on YouTube. And there was this one video, it was a couple birds, a toad, and a possum just playing dead, and some scientists talking about what they were doing. And I just watched it over and over again and was very captivated by this image. And so I wondered, do humans do this? What's going on? Because the scientists narrating the video were saying that it's involuntary, even though they were calling it playing dead. So after doing some research, I found out that not only do humans also do this, but it's the most common response to sexual assault. And yet no one was really talking about it. And it wasn't, playing dead's kind of a playful term or misnomer, but it's the specific behavior these animals were exhibiting is called tonic immobility, which is an extreme form of freezing. And it's equivalent to basically having a severed spine where you can't move at all and can't speak. And so I found out scientists had known about this for many, many, many years and just completely ignored it. And it wasn't being talked about at all in the legal context. And many women who were seeking justice were having their cases dropped because police or prosecutors just didn't understand that that could actually be a legitimate response to trauma. And also women were blaming themselves because they didn't react. And so I think that it started out kind of wondering, what happened there, and then kind of investigating after that, like what is the language sexual assault survivors are using when they are sharing their stories. And so freezing came up in almost every context, and it was usually very vague, or it referred to different things. So it was sort of this colloquial term that was being sort of not taken that seriously because it meant everything and nothing at the same time. So the project kind of began as interrogation of, like what does fear look like from a female perspective in a way? And like how, like specifically I say female because it's like intersecting, as the book discusses a lot, with gendered scripts and the cultural context of each person involved. And how is that determining sort of like the, everything from like a healing journey to, the interactions with advocates or, the legal world, etc. And so from there, I kind of kept interviewing women, finding more responses that no one talked about, and felt like this was a problem that I wanted to explore.
Yeah, and there's so much, and you published an incredible piece kind of focused on freezing in the Times magazine,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
developed that material and expanded it. I think there were things in here that I read that I didn't
Yeah,
remember
one
trying.
chapter is based on a piece I published in the New York Times, specifically on freezing, but focusing more on this extreme form of freezing.
There's a line where you kind of get in such a powerful, succinct way at exactly the kind of reimagining of trauma responses and that you're talking about right now. At one point early on in the book, you put it so simply and beautifully. Self-preservation doesn't always look like what we imagine it does. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that means in the context of the book, some of the varieties of self-preservation that you map and explore, some of the varieties of self-preservation that so often get misunderstood as passivity, a lack of agency, sometimes even as consent, maddeningly. And I also thought maybe you could read us, there's a particular passage where you sort of interrogate this question of like, where did I learn to respond to danger in this way, that I think gets it a lot quite powerfully, if you wanted to read it.
Yeah, maybe I'll start there. this is in the first chapter, and I do try to dip in and out of other contexts, not just sexual violence, because really the brain works in the same way in reaction to fear, no matter sort of what the circumstance. So this is sort of an example of that. In Los Angeles years ago, I was on my friend's bed with my legs folded to my chest, talking on the phone with my mom, when a man opened the door. He wore all black with a gloved hand that held a knife. All the noise I'd been hearing in the kitchen wasn't my roommate, but this man. He must have thought no one was home. But this isn't about a robbery. It's about my reaction to it. I told my mom I had to go, and then I smiled at the man and said pleasantly, loudly, and as gently as possible, "Hi," and the man ran off. Why and when had I learned to respond to fear with a look of joy? So that's one of those examples where if I had imagined in my head some man coming into, my room with a knife, you know, I would either run or fight him in my head, right? But then we don't have this response or imagination of a response that's just passivity or smiling or being polite. And so it's really interesting. Like one of the most interesting things I found while writing this book was about this like range of freeze responses, and early on, the most common response for sexual assault victims, at least, is to freeze, but in a way where you can still be moving around. Like it's not just the body being stilled, that's more of like a later extreme reaction. And in these early freeze responses, it's horrifying, but we have automatic behaviors that our brain just like falls back on and like deploys. And so we'll just be like, if, women are conditioned often, to be super polite. And so that's kind of what was happening at that moment. And I had no idea that's what my response would be. And luckily he still ran away because maybe it scared him. But it's you can imagine that in the context of sexual violence, and then trying to have to tell a story about that afterwards, and how awkward and horrible that would be to tell a police officer. For me, like that situation was just funny, but in like another context it might not be. So understanding that, I don't think that kind of information is really translated at all into the context of how police listen to stories or understand them. And there's a lot of other interesting things going on there too. I mean, like freezing can just look like there's no thoughts at all, or it could just dampen your ability to make good decisions, like just like walking away even. And so it just kind of complicates our idea of like, it's so easy to say no and just get out of a situation where it's actually like very complicated and difficult to say no. And I think we don't give enough grace to people in situations where there's fear, that their responses can be very strange on the outside. And so the book constantly looks at those behaviors and compares them to how someone tries to tell a story about them or doesn't tell a story because it feels strange. And on the extreme side of that, some women I talked to had near-death experiences when they were being attacked, and so that there's an interesting intersection there, where they would go into places where there's like a tunnel of light, and they felt very warm and safe, and it was even like an experience of great pleasure. So again, I don't think anyone's ever really talked about that, or like what do you do when you have to tell that story, especially if it's like a violent rape, like, but then you were disassociating to the point where you were feeling warmth and pleasure. So there's just sort of like all these little nuanced moments that can happen along a spectrum of survival strategies that we kind of ignore. And yeah, I think looking at sort of there's sort of the responses that happen during an event and then after, and I did look at both of those. I think another interesting example is that it, like disassociation can cause distortions or hallucinations, and there's actually a moment on Mad Men that does a really good example of the boss is raping a secretary, I think, and but the shot is from her perspective, which is really rare, and it's just of the street traffic, and it gets really loud. So if an officer went and talked to her, she'd be like, I don't remember anything. I just saw the traffic and there's like a taxi going by.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would have to understand that like trauma created that memory for her, and then it was not consensual.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of these things kind of are helpful for the storytelling, but for the victims too.
And there's just that thinking about that Mad Men example. There's a story you tell in the book that echoes that in a really chilling way about it was like a cop or a prosecutor who was working with a woman who had been raped in the back of a taxi cab, and what she had was a really intense memory of like
Yeah.
the side of the cab.
Yeah, the only reason they were able to charge him was because she remembered the exact number of like the exact pattern on the handle in the taxi cab. And so it's like, well, if she wanted the sex, she wouldn't be looking at a handle and memorizing the number of lines on it, is their kind of argument. But
Mhm.
only because that woman was trained to understand trauma responses was she able to make that argument
Mhm.
effectively.
Yeah, and I mean, throughout, I was just struck by the way that you pay such attention to the stories that haven't aligned with all of these really reductive, oppressive, and toxic notions we have of, you know, um, what a good assault victim, what kind of stories she should tell, what kind of experience she should have. And you're looking at all of these kinds of narrative uh, messier narratives that are, not only kind of making room for them, but really exploring how trauma produces forms of storytelling that have been often used against victims
Mhm.
and survivors. And I found that, alternately maddening to read, but ultimately that's part of what felt so necessary and important about the work you're doing. And I just want to kind of name for the room some of the many kind of modes and materials that you bring together in this project, because to me, on a craft level as well as like an ethical and emotional level, it really is staggering. Like, you bring together personal narrative, intimate and often quite difficult reportage, cultural history, inquiries into physiology, criminal procedures, and legal cases. You take us from a training session designed to help cops and prosecutors understand how trauma affects storytelling. You take us to a refugee camp in Iraq. You take us to 2 prisons in Illinois, where you tell the stories of some of the women incarcerated there. You take us to your own childhood, learning survival strategies in the Oregon wilderness. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of how and to what ends you're drawing on all of these threads in exploring these like kind of primal and challenging questions.
Yeah, so structuring this book was incredibly difficult, and it felt like a leap of faith going forward. I kind of started with freezing, and this image of animals playing dead was kind of always at the top of the page, sort of reminding me to stay kind of focused on the theme of the book, which becomes frozen women, basically. But I didn't know where I was going. But with each interview I did, usually the subjects would say something really interesting that would lead to the next chapter.
Mm.
For example, after I wrote about freezing and frozen women, one of the subjects, as an aside, just said, "By the way, I have these really strange seizures ever since I was raped, and they're not epilepsy," and it was really confusing. She's like, well, it kept me trapped in my body in a weird way. Maybe that's a kind of freezing too, but it was just kind of an aside. And so I ended up sort of investigating that and finding out it's actually a really common response to trauma as well. And I think, thinking about the seizure specifically and like adding context to it, adding context to show the weight of not only how much we've ignored the science and the history, but also how it intersects with like research that's already been done and ignored. They've seen this in other contexts. They've people to criticize the women having these seizures. Most of them were told they were making stuff up or faking it, etc. So it's like you kind of think back to Charcot's hysteric women. It's like a continued pathology, and so just kind of deepening the ways these women are experiencing it by sort of padding their internal stories with as much kind of context as I can give for why uh, the experience is so much worse than just a physical response. It brings them into a place of incredible shame that they can't even get medical help for it. And then that kind of kept going. Like each chapter, I just felt like I kept kind of finding new things just through reporting. I mean, that's a very natural process. You can't really know much until you start reporting. You can read as much as you want, but it's really just like you have to talk to people. And I didn't feel like I was like trying out characters or finding the best one. I really kind of stuck with whoever kind of got back to me and felt like they were excited to talk for most of the cases. So some of them, there was some difficult, like the stories were kind of complicated to distill a bit and were but I ended up finding they took me in very interesting directions. And I kind of moved back to the beginning to front load it with personal experience. I think just to kind of give the reader a sense of, what's the origin story of my thinking, who is this person writing the book? But I didn't feel like I could really write that until I wrote through to the end. And it was interesting because I would interview these women and they would make me think of stories from my life. And so then I would write those down. And so it was sort of like autobiography via reporting, which was really interesting. And I couldn't have known any of the stuff about myself without first like sharing a conversation with these women. And so that I felt very grateful for that throughout and very like in communication with the subjects in a way that I hadn't been before in many reporting projects. And, even if it was, just like um, a small story compared to theirs, like it still felt like I could build that into the text in a way that invited sort of a range of stories. Like not some of them are very quiet and small, so they're not all big events.
Right, which does so much for the book in terms of kind of positioning so many of these responses to very extreme experiences of trauma in relation to lived experiences that pretty much there's not like a woman I know who hasn't experienced fear in some way, and you kind of liberate us from these binary black and whites of sort of whether you've lived through something or not, and position experiences and a kind of range. I wonder if you could give a couple of examples. It's so fascinating to hear you talk both about how listening closely to your subjects kind of often took you to maybe the next realm of inquiry in the book, and also this dynamic of autobiography through reporting that you describe, how talking to subjects kind of brought up memories or experiences. And I wonder if you could just share a few of those that ended up becoming part of the book, some of the kind of autobiography that you accessed through these conversations with other women.
Yeah, I think so. It made me think about my childhood, and I mean to start kind of resonating with the science in the book. My mom was a naturalist, and she always took me out into the woods to learn about animal survival and how I should survive in the woods. So we practiced playing dead. That's a big part of the book. So it's like if a bear comes, you should play dead. And it was kind of that moved into a way of like looking more closely at my mom. Like, why was she teaching me this? Why was she so worried? And she ended up opening up to me about some interesting events that were related to freezing or sort of passivity and survival. And she was working in the lumber industry in Oregon and went and off with a supervisor to do some field work. And he convinced her, pushed her to do some field work on a ledge that was very dangerous, but she did it anyway because she felt like she had to. And then she fell and just hurt herself terribly and broke her back. And kind of just looking at all these moments of like you could call them submission, but it's more complicated than that in the end. But like of my mother kind of like feeling like she's giving up her power to men throughout her life, and just I hadn't kind of thought about that as like a through line, and that her mother too and just like the ways that they, each generation
Mhm.
kind of responded to difficulties or patriarchy that like was part of, is of course worse maybe the farther back you go, but and then yeah, just thinking about, like for example, there was like a moment in high school where there was like a creepy guy at a party, and I think I disassociated,
Mhm.
but I just thought I was having a religious experience when I was
Mhm.
like 19. I was like, oh, that was weird. And then, the context was like, my mom's really into ghosts and spirituality, so I was like, oh, becoming like my mom. Like, there's this whole narrative that like wasn't even
Right.
real, but just because I didn't know what a disassociation was,
Mhm.
and so like only after writing this book did I even remember that that happened. and
Mhm.
and then I realized like, oh, this is interesting intersection of like trauma and religion, but also just like misinterpretations of fear that's probably pretty rampant.
Well, and certainly one of the dynamics that I think you articulate so powerfully and with such kind of um, rigorous compassion in this book is the ways that women have kind of turned on themselves for self-preservation responses that
Mm.
you're digging into as acts of self-preservation, but over and over again we hear your subjects in this book asking themselves some version of what's wrong with me, why didn't I
Yeah.
fight, why did I freeze, why did I raise my hips to let him slide off my skirt. And part of what you're doing here is really reframing those as not what's wrong with you, but here's why. As you say, offering all this context for these behaviors radically reframes them and takes away that, offers an alternative to that element of kind of culpability. But just that idea of you talking about revising or returning to certain experiences that you've had with a really different understanding of what was going on, that's something that many of your subjects are describing going through a version of themselves or sort of almost going through across the course of their conversations with you. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the relationships that you built with some of the women whose stories you tell in this book, because you don't necessarily go into a lot of kind of extra narration about your dynamics with them, but it's so clear from the places that the parts of their stories that you're going to and the kind of compassion you're bringing to their stories that you've built. I mean, both that you were listening very closely, you were listening to them talk about some of the most difficult things that had ever happened to them, and that you built up a tremendous amount of trust. So I wonder if there's a way you could sort of talk about those relationships, building those relationships, if there are a few that come to mind that had a particular kind of arc or texture to them that will stay with you.
Yeah, I think the first that comes to mind is Amanda, who lived in Canada, and she was the first person I contacted. It was just through Instagram about having these non-epileptic seizures, which were sort of a way of like, after, usually in every case that I of the subjects I talked to, they had frozen during a sexual assault, and then later they were trembling and having these very active seizures, and sometimes they would act out the assaults and they would dissociate or see something coming after them. So it was a bit of a uh, a very confusing experience, especially since they would often lose their memories during the event. But Amanda was super excited to talk to me, which was great. She said no one had ever asked her about this, and invited me to come visit her in Canada. But it was quite hard because I didn't quite realize at the time how still inside of this event was.
Mm-hmm.
There's a total difference between interviewing someone, 10 years out versus like in the moment that they're still trying to recover from trauma. And when I arrived, well, she couldn't leave her house, so we met at her house, because she would have so many seizures, just all day. She was having seizures, she just collapsed. So I was quite horrified that she was going to have one while we were there, and trying to be really careful. And I think that, she would kind of stop and dissociate sometimes, and I would try to take breaks, and basically I would just draw on everything I tried to learn from conveniently going to a conference on trauma informed interviewing
Mm-hmm.
prior to this, which you mentioned with the police
Mm-hmm.
investigators. And most of that is just like talking to them about like telling your story and not really asking that many questions except for them to like kind of keep going with their narrative or inviting them to keep talking. Um, but yeah, it was just so sad. It was hard. It was hard to talk to her. She uh had tried to commit suicide 2 weeks before I arrived, which I found out only after I was there. And then she wrote me after I came back and was like, "I'm so happy we talked. It felt amazing to finally get the story out from someone that wasn't just like my boyfriend or my family." And then she wrote back again later and was like, "Oops, I went back and the seizure stopped, but then they came back and I feel horrible again." And that kind of conversation happened just kind of over and over again. So that's sort of part of it too, is like um, thinking about this, each of these women's kind of like their ongoing stories, and so kind of I felt like there was I added a little bit of that back and forth in there, but it's kind of a ongoing conversation with us
Mhm.
that feels very interesting. But that was a totally different dynamic where like the storytelling was really useful for her
Mhm.
and interesting, whereas when I went to a women's prison in Illinois, I got there thinking these stories are so um, important, and obviously these women should not be in jail anymore. They should be released because they all killed someone based on self-defense, um, and had significant domestic violence uh, used against them, sexual violence, etc. And so they were punished for surviving. And
Mhm.
so I got there and they're just like, I had all this sort of hope and excitement over this, like, just tell me your story, I'll try to publish it. And then they were just like, oh, we told our story already. We told our story here. Like, there's no point. No one cares. No one
Mhm.
listens. And I thought that was, yeah, that kind of made me pause and kind of made me, and I also felt that after writing their stories, I was like, yeah, this isn't going to get them out of jail or make a
Mhm.
difference. Um, it kind of made me think a little bit about like why we always talk about storytelling. It's like, this is the way out. This is, if you just tell your story, you'll be saved, right? It's like this, it's such an important part of our conversation. But then in some contexts, it's really not. And it
Mhm.
made me kind of think about, that's kind of like maybe an idea for the privileged
Mhm.
or whatnot. And so that chapter really kind of reckons with that question a bit, and kind of leaves it at that, where it's like, here's the story, but it's not going to make a difference now. Maybe one day it would,
Mhm.
but it kind of had a very different relationship to storytelling.
Mhm.
And I guess that's kind of where each person kind of left me to, was like, how is telling this story useful or not useful? And how are you telling it that feels important to like the arguments in the book, and kind of
Mhm.
trying to maintain that internal logic,
Mhm.
as well as kind of either comment or not comment on it afterwards, depending on kind of where it headed.
Mhm. Yeah, there's so I think one of the kind of meta narratives that's like arches over the entirety of the book, kind of through all of these individual stories, is this question of kind of what are the uses of storytelling. And then, but absolutely, it's not a sentimental kind of storytelling, as like storytelling is always salvation. Storytelling, um, storytelling is a site of much compounded trauma in this book. Not only the ways that the stories survivors tell, as you so eloquently break down, are often used against him, but also in the cases of Lakonda and Debraka and Angel, like you give us their voices saying, "What good is it going to do me to tell you my story? It didn't do me. I've told my story many times, as you say." And part of, I think, what you do in terms of complicating our notions about storytelling and what it can offer is to put their voices in the book, asking that question and expressing that skepticism. That said, there is something incredibly powerful, I think, about putting their stories here, not despite, but because their stories haven't
Mhm.
gotten them out of prison yet. Like, it feels that much more important that their stories be visible and be allowed to kind of reach people. And I wonder, in that vein, if you might just read us that. I
Oh
think
yeah.
there was a paragraph you had from Lakonda's story that's so powerful.
So the part I'm going to read is about her meeting. She was well, kicked out of her house. She fled her house because of sexual abuse and then ended up working on the streets as a sex worker. And this is when she meets the man she'll eventually kill. It was 2001, and Laconda was on the winter streets with cold feet when a man named Julius rolled by. He was 5'5" and bald with a mustache. He told her to get in the car, and she got in. The car was so warm and comfortable that she started crying. He took her home. She was about 24 and he was 46. She was waiting for him to try to have sex with her, but he told her not to worry. They didn't need to have sex. No one had ever said that to Laconda. Not ever. In the shower, she closed her eyes and felt her muscles go from stiff to loose. Later, she cooked dinner for the both of them, chicken and rice with corn, and they talked about her childhood. She told funny jokes and then laughed together, even about things that weren't funny. His bed was so soft, she called it freaky. It didn't take much to keep her. I gave him that power right there, she told me. The next night, Julius spooned Laconda, and she had never been spooned. Even with her children's fathers, it was always just sex with them. It felt like he truly wanted to be with her.
Yeah, and you, in telling those stories, you give us access to these women as multidimensional, infinite subjectivities, not just women to whom the things have been done, or women who have perpetrated violence. Or there's a fullness, even as there's also an acknowledgement of your position as somebody who's only telling a partial tale. But there's an attention to some of those small moments of desire and pleasure and safety that only deepens, I think, the impact of what they have survived. And
Yeah, and that was an important part of the reporting too, and the writing obviously was to always look for these sort of moments of beauty and moments of joy and moments where they were just like wanting basic things in life, like candy. Or there's a moment where Laconda just stands in front of the mirror when she's a kid after being bullied at school and just listens to Prince and dances and says, you're beautiful, over and over again in the mirror. And it's just, those were the moments, I remember most. I don't remember the moments where she's just talking about some guy beating her up. Like, I remember the person around that. And so I really tried to capture that because we don't really need more of that, the violence necessarily. So I tried to really write around those moments. And it just, I feel like doing that also just makes it even more, it's just easier to follow the psychology that we so often dismiss as being unbelievable, without kind of seeing the pathways towards certain decisions. So, I mean, oh, sure, like the news will report that, like, this woman, Dubraka, they reported that she was having an affair with her landlord, but really her landlord forced her into a sex for rent situation. And she had 10 kids and they were all starving, and her husband beat her if she didn't pay the rent. So it's like these contextual details about her love for her children that I felt like kind of like propelled that argument in a really compelling way that just like you can't really look away from it anymore. And it becomes even harder to take when like the lawyer that was trying to help their sentences be reduced spent 5 years with them listening to their stories. So this lawyer also had the same details that I had, knew everything about what their wants and desires. All of that was presented to the judge, and these women have already been jailed for like a decade or more. So they've already spent time. But then the judge for Laconda's case and Dubraka's case was just like, no. I think Dubraka got just a couple years taken off. But in response, the lawyer was kind of saying like, is it worse when they, when they believe you? Wait, then what is the quote?
it's like, is it worse when they don't believe you, or worse when they believe you and still think?
Yeah. It's like we always just talk about, believing women is the most important thing. But is it worse? Yeah, when they do believe you and then nothing changes, I think is what she's kind of saying. And that's that kind of goes against that narrative where it's like, oh, if we just have the story and we believe the women, that everything's gonna be
Right.
fine. Because it's like, no,
Right.
they believe them, but they're still racist and sexist, and they
Mhm.
don't think that these women's stories matter.
Mhm.
And just kind of like capturing that sentiment, I felt like was just like where kind of that piece landed,
Mhm.
and it is so mixed in with this dismissive dismissal of connecting it back to like trauma and fear and experiences. It really is related to that in an unexpected way.
Mhm.
But because if we think about like self-defense laws, it's like, well, why didn't you make this decision to like escape, or
Mhm.
why didn't you make
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
decision not to
Yeah.
kill him? It's like, oh well, next time
Yeah.
I have a gun in my head, like I'll make sure I like
Right. Yeah.
step out the door more quickly or something.
Right.
It's like it doesn't
Right.
actually make sense in the
Yes.
context of like
Yeah.
being afraid.
Yeah.
So in that way, it's like it was kind of like stepping away from the narrative just a little bit, but kind of winds
Mhm.
back to
Mhm.
that beginning point.
Yeah, and one of the things I really respect about this book and how you present, especially their stories, is you refuse to offer the reader a kind of resolution or consolation that these women themselves have not gotten because they haven't gotten justice. And I wonder if this is going to be the last question I ask you, although I have pages and pages, but I know there are other questions in the room, so we'll open it up after this one. But I wonder, even though this is not a book that offers kind of sentimental or false closure or consolation, you do arrive at some pretty interesting and transformative ideas about the possibilities of maybe more collective forms of healing. And part of how you get there is through the story of a woman named Louisa, whose story is the last story you tell in the book. So I wonder if maybe you could just tell us a little bit about Louisa's story and sort of how it maybe opened up some new ideas about the possibilities of collective healing for you.
Yeah. So briefly, Louisa is an anthropologist that I talked to, who has written publicly about experience of being raped in the field, and she had such an interesting story that really changed my thinking about recovery. Um, and basically, she talks about um, her post-rape experience while reading westernized sort of manuals about how to recover. So her recovery was like made her think that like, oh, I have to be resilient. I have to like be the same exact person I was before this terrible
Mm.
event. I am not allowed to have moments where I feel like I can't function normally. And she continues to be haunted by like these invisible hands and sees the man everywhere like a ghost and all these things that she just really needs to tone down a little bit to be able to function as a person. Like she really wants to be able to live again, basically, and that was part of it. So she initially was pressured by people in Sierra Leone, where she was doing her research to kind of try different things, and she just dismissed it at first. But then later, kind of went back and started reading post-colonial narratives about trauma and recovery, and realized how much there's like a Western dominance over like how we even understand trauma. And that's something we kind of don't talk about very much at all. But she um, decided to take a new approach and kind of embrace some of the thinking of the culture she was in, while also kind of drawing on other collective societies, which is kind of like thinking about like you're not alone in your pain, and like what happens to one person also happens to others, and
Mhm.
it's just less individualistic, like an American society. We're kind of all about self-reliance and recovery and power. Um, so she it was kind of amazing what she talked about, but she ended up like using that idea of collective society and then looking herself in the mirror every day and imagining herself through the eyes of like her neighbor or the person down the street, or the person at the store, and every day she would just see herself through someone else's viewpoint, and until eventually she could see herself as someone like because they weren't seeing her as like a raped person or a victim. Like she was just like, oh, I'm just me and all these different versions of myself, anthropologist, academic, a wife.
Mhm.
So she that was actually her like mode of recovery,
Mhm.
was using someone else's eyes. And then
Mhm.
I noticed that was also a pattern throughout the whole book that I hadn't even noticed before until I got
Mhm.
there. Um, there's a woman, Stacy, who can't access a certain memory unless she goes through the eyes of a neighbor to see it, and then she's able to see that she was really harmed in a situation, but she has to like leave herself and see, use a community to heal. And then Helen Garner does that a little bit in the beginning when I take a quote from her book about like a creepy man kissing her on a train, and she just like freezes, and then she can't get out of this frozen state until a stranger looks at her and she sees herself through the stranger's eyes, and then she's able to see that she's you know it's okay to like move and act out. So it's just like this weird like gaze of release that happens in a collective setting that was really kind of amazing.
Yeah.
That just kind of like popped up naturally throughout, but it's like more concretized like through this anthropologist study, of course.
Yeah.
And really interesting to think about.
Yeah. Oh, that's so powerful how her account sort of allowed you to see differently these patterns that existed in other women's
Oh, that
stories.
reminds me, I have a show and tell. And this so this is a frozen Charlotte. It's a little frozen woman doll. And so this sat on my desk the whole time I was writing the book. And it's like made me think about a lot of things, like both how like we understand frozen women like culturally, because these were like dolls little girls played with, but the doll is a frozen Charlotte because the character of Charlotte went out with a guy to a ball in a snowstorm, but didn't want him to think she was ugly, so she didn't put on her coat. And that was kind of just thinking about these like norms of female behavior that cause us to end up dead or frozen.
Thinking
but
about sorority girls in Iowa.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So, but like, yeah, I also brought the arm. It's like in my pocket. It's like, here's the arm. But I was like, oh, I should put this back together again. But then, like thinking about Louisa's story, I kind of liked it being more fragmented. It's just and just like this idea of like having to recover, and it's okay to kind of have this like damaged self that we carry with us. But yeah, that was kind of like where, I don't know, this weird object, this frozen woman stayed with me the whole time.
I love
and
that
I
she's
just,
been
I
in
just
your
had,
pocket for this
I,
whole
yeah, this whole
conversation.
time.
It's perfect.
I feel like she never leaves my
Yeah.
sight now, so I just had to bring that out.
Amazing. Thank you.
You guys can hold it if you want.
Buy a book, come to the signing line, hold the frozen Charlotte. All right, I think we have time for a few questions from the audience.
How did you identify the women to interview?
Yeah, so she asked how I identified women to interview. And so it started actually, it was more work to start. So I went to shelters and sexual violence advocacy groups, and just sent out an email saying what I wanted to do and saying like if anyone wanted to talk to me, they could go through the person in charge at that institution, and then we could talk about what was going to happen next, what we would talk about. So there was some safety in that. It wasn't kind of like sending messages directly, and I got a lot of responses that way. Actually, it was nice. And then I also was connected with people through, like some of the experts I talked to. I often asked, do you know anyone? Have you ever talked to a woman who had this or that? And that was also a good way to find people. A woman I wrote about at the beginning of the book, it was actually very hard to find someone to talk about tonic immobility. And the woman I found was through a psychologist, and she, she was in the military, and they dismissed her case because she didn't scream, even though there were people around. And so it just kind of kept going like that, snowballing, so that I had more and more contacts, and then more and more people could introduce me to subjects. But again, like I found an agoraphobic woman. That was hard, right? Someone who doesn't leave their house. So I was like, how am I ever going to find this woman? So I went to Facebook for that.
I'm wondering if or how you thought about releasing a book that offers women to be empowered narrators of their own stories, kind of against this tide of a cultural force right now that often is trying to take that power away and that reposition that narrator's voice to someone outside of those bodies?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. That's certainly every month it feels like it's looming, right, more and
Mhm.
more of the material. And I feel like that was actually lingering when I structured the book as well, thinking about, like is the structure subversive in a way by having so many women talking, so many women telling their stories? Like I wanted it to feel like an onslaught. So like some women just come in for a sentence and others have longer time on stage, but it feels like I wanted it to be enough voices that it would be harder to say this is not
Mhm.
actually a problem or
Mhm.
dismiss it. And so that was a big part of the thinking there. It's a bit of a chorus mosaic structure. But when I was writing about freezing, the science was it took months and months. And I feel like it was like 500 peer-reviewed papers, even though the science ends up being about a paragraph in the book. But it's because I was so nervous
Mhm.
about getting it wrong, and there's a bunch of sort of
Mhm.
like um, articles online, like more right wing pieces, kind of saying like it's trying to dismiss the science or say it's fake news. So that was certainly part of my thinking with certain material, that trying to kind of make it more airtight in that respect. Yeah. Hi.
Um, with the articles we read and relating experience with the firefighter and with the all males, and there were times when they would freeze in certain situations. When a man had died and he had direction and he died, they would turn it over to her to deal with. And this is early on. Is there any evidence there's a similar reaction in males?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Exact same. Yeah. And I have one example of a soldier at war, and he goes into tonic immobility and won't react until someone actually has to slam something on his head, on his helmet. Like he just needs
Mm.
to be knocked out of the state. And there's examples from shipwreck survivors, oil platform explosions, natural disasters. So there's a ton of research on that, but it had been disregarded more so in the
Mhm.
context of sexual assault. But that was a huge part of like the neuroscientist I kind of was constantly talking to for that piece was always like, make sure you mention that it happens to men in war, because then people will believe you. So he always used that when he was talking to police officers and stuff as a way to like
Yeah.
show how
Yeah.
it's like the brain is working the same exact way, and the intersection with um culture and gender ideology is when there's like some shifts, but you're still frozen.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Maybe I think we have time for one more
Sure.
question. Yeah.
So talk a little about the role of courts and judges, or have talked about this so far. If a judge were to read the book, what do you think would be one of the top two lessons?
Yeah, so she asked if a judge read my book, if he would maybe change, or what would the takeaway be, or what happens when the people actually making these decisions about other people's lives have this information. And so I have actually asked not judges, but some defense attorneys, prosecutors, like, here's this information. What do you think? And they were a bit dismissive, some of them. They're like, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. Um, and part of their problem is like the science might be too complicated, or we have to pay for expert witnesses to come in, which is true, and that's actually a problem. So I think that there's the structurally it still doesn't work, even if a judge was able to kind of like consume that material appropriately. It doesn't mean necessarily that evidence would even be brought up in the trial, which would probably have to happen before he could like take that in account. But of course, that would be a first step and a huge benefit. I think right now a lot of the work is starting with the first people survivors like contact, which would be the police, unfortunately. So, and kind of, most I don't remember the statistics, but it's like basically like 99% or something like don't quite make it through,
Mm.
to trial or conviction if that's what someone wants. And so starting even getting it past the police stage is a struggle. But that's kind of where a lot of the work is happening now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. I'll just reiterate, this is such an incredible book. And everybody who doesn't have a copy should get one. And I think you can purchase it at the front and then signing in the back. Is that right? Or
Almost.
okay. Yeah, I'm gonna let Molly.
Thank you
Really
all
good,
so
Zen.
much for joining us. Thank you to everyone who has questions. Thank you, Leslie, for moderating a fantastic conversation as always. And thank you, Jen.
Thank
for
you.
celebrating
Thank
this
you
with
all.
us. So, as Leslie was correctly saying,
almost
you
correctly saying.
can buy more copies at the register where you checked in. That much is true. And up there, roughly, is also where Jen will be signing. My coworkers right now are pointing to the little nook where she will be located. So it'll make a little bit more sense when we get her set up. So please just sit tight while we get her all the way back there. And then once we have her set up, please make sure you grab all of your personal belongings with you so we can start to break down and rearrange the store. And please be mindful of our staff who will be coming around to put away all the chairs. We also have copies of Leslie's book Splinters, which if you haven't read it yet, you must purchase it tonight because it's also fantastic. And if you're still with us online, you can buy both of those by clicking the link in the live stream description. I think that covers everything. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. Let's give these two one last round of applause.